So I'm going to be talking about the right amount of trust for artificial intelligence. And when I say AI, I also mean kind of anything where a human being is interacting with a machine of some type of service, anything like that. So I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI. I have a lot of experience in product and business development. And I've worked at a lot of different companies like Microsoft, Waze, and KAYAK. I also started my own company that I ended up failing at, and I'll be talking about why in just a few slides. But if you want to say nice things about me on the internet, go ahead and use my Twitter handle. So the first thing we're going to talk about when we talk about trust is actually one of the startups I did, which was called Complete Seating. And Complete Seating was essentially an open table competitor. It focused a lot on the operational side of restaurants. And so how do hosts actually do a better job of managing intake of reservations, helping people that are, say, on the wait list understand where they are on that wait list, how long they have to wait, and then the general flow of people through the tables within the restaurant. And in particular, the outcomes you're trying to look for that are maybe the quantifiable ones are how many turns per table, so how many people you seat per shift, but also utilization of the tables overall. And then there's, wait time for people that are coming in is pretty important, but there's another aspect, which is just how do you make people's experiences very entertaining, especially for middle to high-end restaurants. And what was interesting about this is that it was back when I think we were still talking about business intelligence. If it was launched today, it would be AI for restaurants, but we were maybe like 2 generations of the terminology late. And so one of the big problems with this was we really focused an awful lot on trying to understand the dining room floor at such an innate way that we could do the job of the host in some ways. At least that's what we thought going into this, right? That we could understand how tables combine, which is not as obvious as you think it would be. And then do the prediction task of how long someone will actually sit at a restaurant table. And so it's a lot like a job queuing problem from a computer science standpoint. People are coming in, they're gonna sit at a table for so long, they're gonna utilize that table as a resource for so long. And we built some very smart stuff, I think. We built things that at first was not perfect, but still covered the majority case. We slowly inched that up to the high, mid 90 percentile. And this was the interface that we were using. We were not using Bootstrap like the last presenter was in their interfaces. We did do a Bootstrap version of this. But one of the things that we would do is for the actual hosts, we would tell them the table that we would recommend that would allow for the best flow through the restaurant. They could also lock things in. That would be kind of like, if we're penciling things in from the computer, they're penning things in that can't be moved. And it's kind of like they set a rock in the stream and we move around it. Now, as I said, a lot of it worked pretty well. But the issue is that because as people started using this, it was buggy. It was making simple mistakes, in some cases, at least simple to humans. We burned a lot of their trust up front. And so what that meant is by the time we got to the point that the mechanism or the algorithm actually worked fairly well, they were not believing it anymore. They were locking things in more by themselves. And in the end, it just was an experience where, because we did not build the trust the way we should have up front, which was probably helping them avoid errors rather than telling them what to do, we ended up losing a real opportunity. This was not the only reason why we failed, just to be clear, but it was probably one of 3 key reasons why I think we failed. And so, talking about trust, there's a lot of academic research that's gone into the automation, trust and automation. If you think about it, aviation has been thinking about this problem for tens of years. The military has been thinking about it for maybe 30 or more. And so there's a lot of past knowledge to think about. So when we talk about trust, maybe from a psychological standpoint or between human beings, a lot of it is about the idea of some contract that is either written or unwritten. And a lot of the time it's based on cultural norms. It talks about, based on the experience that I'm expecting in the future, how you live up to that future. It's based on how you've dealt with me in the past, such as past performance, kind of my ability within this relationship to make choice, which is called agency. The idea of accountability, or how, there was an interesting study recently about in the psychological community around how people that feel more guilty are more likely to be trustworthy. And so that idea of kind of accountability, either emotional or otherwise, is important. And then transparency, how do I understand what you're doing? How do I interpret it, maybe in our terminology? And then finally, trust is something that it starts from a cultural norm standpoint. Going above that is built slowly, but it can be lost very quickly. And so these are just things that if you study a lot of the research about trust between people, these are kind of the parameters that we think about when we think about trust. But it's a little bit different when we talk about automation. And so this is, I think, a very important paper by Parasuraman back in '97 about use, misuse, disuse, and abuse. And so he classifies different levels of trust resulting in different operational behavior between the person that is using some type of machine and the machine itself. And so use is what we would usually assume is just the regular way that automation is used. That I turn it on when I should, I utilize it as automation as I should, and then I turn it off when I'm done. And that's use. When we talk about misuse, it's that I trust the machine so much that I turn it on and I leave it on for cases where I should traditionally intervene in some way. So one example of that would be the self-driving car with Uber, right? Not only did Uber as a company trust that self-driving car more than it should have, so it was disabling certain types of mechanisms, but also the safety driver was maybe not paying attention to the level that it should have, they should have. So that's misuse. The next one is disuse. And so disuse is that I don't trust it at all, and so I don't use it. I don't turn it on when I should, I don't utilize it when it would actually be better than me at doing something. And then the last one, abuse, is kind of a tricky one because it really talks about the relationship between what they'll call the operator, which is the person using the machine, the designer, who is the person that created the machine, and then the management that is trying to enforce some policies. And so basically abuse is when the management tells the designer to build something for their behalf and doesn't take into the account the actual operator. And so there are a lot of bad types of things that happen in those cases. I'm not going to dive too deep in this, but I think one that's very interesting to go into a little bit more is Ayanna Howard, who's down at Georgia Tech, has done a lot of work around emergency robots and the trust of those. And so this particular example was where they had someone doing a task in a room. They would then simulate an emergency experience. The person would walk out into the hall and they'd see this emergency robot with like light sticks and emergency making some sound. It would then go off and do something. And so they wanted to watch whether people would trust this device or this machine. And what happened is that they trusted too much. So in some cases, it would go into a room and just circle in the room, and the person would kind of follow it. Sometimes it would motion like it would wanted them to go through a doorway that was clearly blocked. And so there were very, very few cases that people felt like they should intervene in this case. Now, there's definitely some issues about potentially that they didn't really think it was an emergency situation. But I think what this kind of talks to is that when we talk about the idea of misuse, it's not that we want to have machines trusting us lots and lots. We want them trusting just right at the right amount. Because in this case, and in cases with a lot of emergencies, right, is that you want people to get out of the building. And so you need them to have a sense of urgency so that they'll go and do something about it, rather than walking leisurely out. So that was a very interesting thing. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a paper, if you want to review it, that tries to break down about 15 years worth of automation and trust and automation research. And it gets a very complicated model about all the different things that are related to it, as you can see. But I think another thing to think of as a basis for trust is this idea of relationships, right? So this is the Knapp model of relationships, where when you first actually talk or meet someone, which is at the initiating stage, you start to escalate your friendship in a way, or romantic relationships work this way too, where you start to figure out what ways you may have interests that are mutual, things that you could do together. You'll start to plan things with the other person. You'll start to integrate your life in some way, and then finally bonding is really about the idea that I'm telling other people about the relationship. And a lot of people do this with not only services in their lives, right? But they also do it with automation when, say, Army troops are naming their bomb disposal robots. They're giving them Purple Hearts, right? Like, there's definitely some type of relationship that is being formed between people and machines. Now, it doesn't mean that, it's good to have a bonded relationship with a piece of technology, but maybe it is appropriate in certain cases. One other model that I think about a lot when we talk about trust is, we use this model a lot in product management from the standpoint of how we work within other teams. So imagine that there's a lot of dimensions by which you can either build or lose trust with someone on a team. And so that could be with engineering, that could be with ops, that could be with whoever. And when we talk about this, there are a lot of things that we can do that are above that line that are helpful, right? Like they're things that maybe are expected of us, they're things that are helping the team be more efficient. But then there's those things that are below, and usually the things below for, say, like product people tend to be, you know, I have misspellings in my documents, they're incomplete, they don't make logical sense. But then once I start to help people look around corners, that's when they start to gain trust. And I think something is very similar with the way, if you take a look at all this previous research, what that means when it comes to automation is this idea of kind of, you know, doesn't allow intervention, makes simple mistakes. Those are things where people will lose trust in the automation. But there is this list of things that if you're more interpretable, you allow expertise to be built, things like that, where you start to gain actual trust with the machine itself. And then finally, I think trust actually has a lot to do with human biases. So when we talk about all those key components up front, you know, this idea of illusion control is really the idea that when I press a button, it does something that I need it to. But you know, unfortunately, I have to say that probably a lot of the thermostats that are in your offices are probably not real or not connected to anything. A lot of crosswalk buttons, a lot of elevator door close buttons are all fake. And the reason why is they want to make you feel like you're in control. And so this is definitely a dark pattern of when we talk about automation, but I'm not sure how to necessarily write it with the idea that people do need to feel like they're in control sometimes, even though they may not be. Ambiguity bias, you know, this idea of we don't always know what everybody else is doing in the world, but we're okay with it. But there are things that we want to have control over within our worlds, and if we give that up to automation in some way, that may cause us to have problems. So I think there's something here about biases, I don't know for sure, but I just wanted to bring that up. And maybe the key point of all these things is that as much as we want to have a loss function for trust, it's just not possible, right? There's a lot of human context that goes into it. There's where I'm coming from as a person, as a culture, as experience, and as, you know, maybe the only thing you can really judge is the interactions that you've had with that person, essentially. So, when we talk about designing products for trust, you know, my background again is product. I work for a design consultancy, and so a lot of the work we do for groups that want to, in some way, deploy prediction services or automated decision making ends up being from the standpoint of the human first rather than the machine first. And so one of the case studies I'm going to use is I actually spent a couple days in this truck going around and watching someone fix gas stations. And so this was a project we worked on for PwC and Google. And our reference customer was in the Midwest. They serviced 5 states for fixing gas stations and doing construction for them. And so you can see here that actually a lot of the stuff is almost like they're like IT people now rather than, say, physical gas station repairmen, but it's part of a field service operations group. And so field service operations is broken down to a few key roles. One is the field tech that goes out on site to fix something. So, for example, if the AC broke here in this building, you wouldn't pull the AC out of the building, then ship it back and have it brought back repaired. You would have someone come here to do that. There's dispatchers that help organize that work. There's the warehouse, there's senior field techs, there's managers, there's a bunch of different people that are involved in this business that really cause an impact on it. So one of the things we started to do after kind of sitting in the truck and watching people is we started asking questions, but when the task was how do we make this business more efficient with things like prediction services, we needed to understand better what are those things that we can understand the probabilities about how they trust each other, how they trust the machines today. And this maybe really gets the point that I can't do anything to quantify trust, but I can ask them how they feel about trust with the tools they use. And so we're not saying also with these questions that we're necessarily we're not replacing people all the time. Sometimes we're making people and their interactions with other people more efficient. But the problem will be is that if we are going to have some type of machine take over a task, it means that we need to understand how they would have operated with other people to, say, give information and get information back to take an action, or to even understand how is like accountability work within that organization. And so these are some sample questions that we would ask people up front while we're doing these types of problem interviews. The next thing we do is, this is what I presented on last time during the lightning talk, which is what we call empathy mapping for the machine. But essentially it's an ideation technique that allows, so again, one of the rules of this is that there's no AI jargon in the room. But we're talking about this theoretical system that we want to create that allows people to do something, say, predict whether a job is the right job to assign right now. And we're bringing in designers, product people, the clients, the executives, to then talk about what does it mean from the standpoint of interrogating that whole system to actually build this machine. And so it's something that I think is really effective to do that. I'll link to the article that discusses it, but this is the idea that we need to understand what people are expecting from these machines before we can actually build them, and build them that would be valuable. The next thing is, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with a confusion matrix. We've used the idea of kind of pessimistic ideation around false positives and false negatives to understand that because these systems are non-deterministic in some way, what is the impact of being non-deterministic? And from that standpoint, that means you can start to do a better job of saying, do we need to, say, modify the type of data that we have to watch out for these scenarios? Does it mean that we need to create ensembles of models to be able to detect all these things? Do we need to create heuristics or guide rails? Those are all things that you can start to do by doing kind of what we call confusion mapping, but I realize that might make a room full of data scientists wince a little bit. And then what we do is, once we have all this information from the people that are going to be utilizing these services, we build prototypes. Right? And so this particular prototype was built in Sketch and then put in InVision, okay? So it's not real at all. What it does include, though, is it includes a concept of a kind of assistive chatbot within a group chat. It includes this idea of detection of whether something is ready to actually be assigned or not, and a bunch of other things like part recommendations, solution recommendations. But through this kind of prototyping, we're understanding how people interpret what the machine is doing, maybe creating the right types of systems to provide information as far as state. And so one example of that was when we were talking about the idea of, is this job ready to be assigned? And in particular, the outcome that we were trying to reduce was reducing the number of return trips the second day. And so we at first provided them with a percentage, which was essentially a confidence score, right? Or confidence based on training data. And we found that they had really no idea how to parse that information. And so we decided to hide that a little bit more, and they understood it better, they felt more confident about using the system, and they felt better about intervening whenever the system was potentially wrong as well. Now, it doesn't just have to be web or those types of interfaces. Wendy Ju out of Cornell, who used to be at Stanford, is doing a lot of really interesting work with automotive. And so this system called Waze is essentially a system that sounds like an automotive, kind of an autonomous, she's doing autonomous vehicle work, but also this idea of kind of voice interfaces, where there's an echo in the car, but there's this very complicated like puppet master interface in the back end that allows them to interact with the driver in a way that sounds or seems like an automated system. And so they're able to judge and start to actually collect lots of data about how human beings feel when they are, say, interrupted when they're doing a valuable task. And so it's very interesting. They're starting to use this to train models of distraction. And so some of the scenarios that we would test when we're building these prototypes out is not only just the happy path, right? This is the traditional usability testing. Can they get to the end goal of something? But it's also this idea of incorrect operation. So what does a false negative or a false positive look like in this interface? Do they understand that it's a false positive in some way? Do they understand it's a false negative? The idea of using counterfactual explanations when we talk about interpretability. What types of explanations actually make sense to them? Do they interpret it the right way? Do they build the mental models to be able to understand what the machine is maybe approximately doing? Adversarial examples are really interesting too. So the speaker before, talking about that, understanding whether when there are adversarial examples that come up in the system, will they be able to understand them? Like them being the human should usually be able to detect these things even though machines may not be able to. And then finally, if they feel confident that something is wrong, do they feel that giving feedback or doing some type of intervention is an appropriate one? And that's I think when we talk about the idea of runaway problems with, not necessarily like, I don't believe in the singularity type of stuff, but the idea that, say, automation can create the perfect bureaucracy, I think that is true. And the biggest problem that we can have is we don't allow people to make interventions on those things. So once we present this to people, we then start to ask different questions about how do they understand the system, say at the beginning of it, are they parsing this interface in a way that makes sense to them? But then as they go through the experiences, how has the interface either built or lost trust with them? Do they feel like they trust the system more or less right now? And then also, looking for what are the signals that will actually make someone skeptical of the system itself? And so once we take this type of research in, we do something called the finitization, which is to try to group these things in ways that give us themes. And so Leah, who's on my team, came up with a really, really interesting way to visualize this. And so this is a graph of there were about 5 times as many observations from one study, but these were the ones that had to do with the automation parts of the system. And so the vertical axis is not understanding at the bottom to understanding at the top. The left is negative sentiment to positive sentiment. And so what we start to see is in the bottom 2 quadrants, it's essentially things that we didn't execute correctly from a user experience standpoint. They didn't understand what was going on in general. And so that's either where we need to do a better job of change management or update the interface in some way. The things that were in the upper right-hand corner were where they understood what was going on with the machine, and they also liked it. So these are clear cases where we're building the right type of automation. This was the right type of prediction to create, and this was the right way to present it. In the upper left-hand corner, though, this is where they knew what was happening, but they didn't like it, right? And a lot of that we chalked up initially to just job security, right? Like, this is going to take away my job. This is part of my job. What we started to understand after doing a couple more of these studies was that it wasn't just job security. It was more about what is the thing that humans actually like to do in this particular case, or what do they find meaning in their jobs. And so it's a really important thing to understand is that, yes, you may be able to automate certain aspects of this, but this is one of those cases where if you do need to automate it because of, say, there are lots of errors, that's a good place for you to consider not necessarily illusion of control as a way to deal with that, but in some way making a better interface for the human and the machine to work together. So, in conclusion, I think maybe one of the themes that I've been saying over and over again is that even though we're talking about machines here, and even though we're talking about AI, and I always get that one piece of feedback from someone in a group full of data scientists and engineers that say, this was not about AI, I get you, I understand what you're saying, but the truth is that the tools we build are really just us, right? We're the reflection into our tools. And so the best way for us to understand these tools or how to build the right tools is to talk to people. So I think that's really important. So we need to pull this curtain back, basically. And then the last thing is that when we are talking about trust, it's about the right level. It's not about constantly trying to ratchet up and escalate the amount of trust. It's about trying to find what is the right amount of trust for the actual use that you're trying to create. And if you want to look at this more, I wrote a post about this on Medium, in particular around trust, and dives into this a little bit more. But otherwise, thank you, and I'll take some questions.
How much do you feel like transparency might contribute to trust?
Yeah, transparency is definitely very important. Now, the question is like, what type of transparency are we talking about, right? There's a lot of different human examples of this where perceived transparency is very different than real transparency. So I guess what I would say is that it's important that we provide people with the right options so that we give them agency, right? We give them the ability to opt out. We give them the ability to maybe understand how it impacts them, and then for them to be able to make a decision. And so I guess when I think about transparency, it's not that much different than the idea of interpretability, in all honesty, because it's more about the idea of I'm understanding a state that matters to me. And I can see that in a way that is not, say, obscuring a state that matters to me. So I guess I see those two things as very similar when you get to like what is valuable. Now the idea of an end user seeing all of the weights and biases, like that's not valuable, right? And that, if anything, that probably muddies the conversation, confuses them, and then makes them not care anymore. So I don't know. I guess I see transparency and interpretability as very similar things. Oh, awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
In that last 2x2 you were showing, that upper left, okay, that seems to be where the action is, right? The bottom is about maybe issues of transparency, things about communication, maybe.
Yeah, and interpretability, maybe, things like that.
Accuracy.
Yeah.
Right? But the question is this doing me harm, right? It's basically what the upper left is about.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure. You touched on it in the question of, is this going to take meaning, right? Which is sort of a subtle idea. You only touched on the end. You expand on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the tough thing is that there's aspects of people's jobs that they really love, right? And that is always going to be the issue, that when we're automating things, there are aspects like, I think what's interesting is when we talk about the concept of, say, flow, right? Flow is something where you're kind of in between being bored and being overwhelmed. And so there are a lot of different types of flow that are out there. It's just that unfortunately, when we talk about progress, certain types of flow are not easily paid well, right? So the idea of like whittling wood as a flow activity is something that probably people enjoy, but it's not in line with the objectives of the organization. And so, I don't know, this is where we start to get into the fact that, you know, can we have ethical AI? Can we have ethical computing? You know, all that type of stuff. I think there are ways that we need to think about that for this type of industry, but the truth is that it's organizations or corporations that are going to actually be the main drivers of this, right? Like, and yes, it's very good that Google said that they're not going to be part of the JEDI project, but Booz Allen Hamilton is more than happy to take that work on. And so it's really organizations and governmental policy that are going to be the ways that we protect things that we think are valuable to us as a whole, as a culture. But you know, again, I think there is still value though that some of those aspects of those jobs, like in that particular case, some of the things that were up there were like communication between clients, right? And so for the communication between, say, the dispatcher and the field tech, there were a lot of things that we could get rid of where they didn't, you know, the field tech doesn't want to call in to say where they are, right? Like they don't want to verify that, in this case, the Verizon truck tracking tool was working correctly, which next job they were going to. If they could take care of all that communication, that would be great, right? But the idea of the dispatcher still kind of calming an angry customer about something, that's really valuable still. And so if we were to just take it from the standpoint of like, yes, we can make that efficient, we don't have a loss function for, you know, customer satisfaction necessarily. We have things like following indicators like, you know, basically client retention, for example. But it's really hard to understand what is the value of those things. And so that's where, you know, maybe my main point about all these things is that humans need to make this type of decision about what's valuable, not computers, not machines, not algorithms. Yeah, welcome.
Most of the time, these AI projects are driven by the management and they want quick turnarounds, but the end users are the people where we need to build that trust. And building that trust with the end users would take time because you need to involve them in the process.
Yeah.
And that essentially slows you down. So in such cases, where do you draw the line and how do you communicate with the both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I find that it's valuable to always include the person that's impacted. I mean, I do a tutorial on kind of design thinking and what does that mean for these types of systems, right? So you should always include the people, you should always understand them, right? So now there's a lot of different ways you can do research into understanding what their problems are. You know, like for example, including clients or customers in things like problem understanding, that is really, really key because you may be solving a problem that doesn't matter to them, right? So that's maybe something that I would not skimp on as far as research. The idea though of an expert, they're expert in their problem domain. They're not necessarily experts in what is the next gen solution that could help them out of those problems, right? So they're more likely to band-aid over things, cobble together solutions that they already have. And so I think, you know, I don't think you should ever say that qualitative or quantitative is one over the other. It's both together because quantitative gives you that really like what is going on based on the exhaust we can detect, right? But then the qualitative is understanding the why, it's understanding a lot of context that you may not have there. There's still an issue though, that if you do too much of this type of research, right, qualitative, you can overfit to personal stories too much, right? So anyways, I guess what I'm saying is like you shouldn't skimp on qual when it comes to this. I would say problem identification and validation is most important, and then getting people's feedback about the system you're building is really key. But the problem is I think when we talk about these tight time scales as well, is we're not including iteration, right? And that's the most important thing, is that like we should be able to make changes to these products as not only we learn more, but also as people evolve, right? If anything, that's why we all bemoan legacy systems. It's because they're supposedly unchangeable. Right? But the reality is that it's just because we didn't consider that we would have to change them in the future. And we will. We will always have to change it in the future. Yeah, next question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any experience or directions for, let's take the Wayfair example earlier today.
Yeah.
Where they're trying out a new model and their objective function for that could be increased sales.
Yeah.
Or it could be, you know, ideally, hopefully the customer likes the suggestions
That's right.
more. But how do you do a design thinking process around that when you've really just come up with, here's the conclusion, the user doesn't know which one's worse or better, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is where, like, and I think Wayfair does have a lot of people that do this type of user research. They just may not be working on the same projects as much, which I think is what's interesting is as an aside, I think we're going to start to see, just like design is now part of teams, I think we're going to start to see the same thing with data scientists on the same team, right? But then, from that standpoint, I think what's interesting is, this was an issue when I was at KAYAK, where how you actually understand A/B testing in that case, you could just look at pure revenue dollars, and that would be potentially good. But then you also need to include that even though you may make something easier to buy, it's not the right thing to buy. And so returns are a really important thing. And so, anyways, what you start to see is that, like, for every case of nuance you start to find, you are adding more and more metrics into this loop. And so that's the tough part. So I think there's a certain point where you need to decide, like, what are you trying to, maybe you won't be able to always detect exactly the way the person feels, but at least you're seeing the right types of qualitative indicators that are saying that. Maybe one other thing I would add here is that I actually, I asked the question earlier about that to him, but I do wonder whether, there's always this trade-off of trying to do something that's very interesting versus something that just works. And so in this case, the idea of what is a good recommendation is very nuanced for different types of furniture shoppers. So the idea of, like, my past history may matter an awful lot to what I buy in the future. And that will matter for someone that has a lot of furniture already, right? But if I'm a student that's moving into a place of my own, right, that may be a very different thing. And so I think it comes down to, are you understanding all the segmentation of your customers correctly in some way? And then are you feeding that information back in? Because, I don't know, the question I always ask is, like, if you were to take your recommendation algorithm and you pit it against a pure random recommendation algorithm, which does better? And I know that, like, for some reason people feel really uncomfortable about that, but that's actually the end goal is you should be better than random at least. And you should be significantly better than random if you're investing time in it. Yeah, I mean, serendipity is a really interesting and hard thing to think about too, because, again, that idea of, Stitch Fix has done a lot of talks about this, where they're someone that involves the idea of a human and an algorithm working together in some way, and they actually have many different cycles of computers and humans. And so, their biggest issue is that for people that have regular taste in something, it's very easy for them to give a recommendation. But for someone that has a very extreme taste, it's actually very hard for a computer to give that recommendation. It's kind of like Netflix's, like, Napoleon Dynamite problem, right? Like, I don't know if you're gonna like Napoleon Dynamite based on your past watching experience. It's just so random, right? And so, I guess when it comes to that is it depends on what you care about as an individual, right? Because I care about certain particular aspects where serendipity is good, and it only happens ever so often. Because we're all very much creatures of habit, right? Like, we have brands that we use every day. That's why, like, people like Target try to go after people that are newly pregnant, is because that's a moment for them to be able to switch brands on everything, right? And so, I don't know, this idea of, like, recommender systems is really, really delicate, because it's, if I don't know what to do and I don't care, right? That's kind of one recommender system. That's the Stitch Fix model. Like, I don't care enough to really choose my own clothing. And by the way, most of this outfit is Stitch Fix. So I try to look good, every now and then. And but then there's other things where I actually go out, like my backpack, which is one of the purchases that I'm really happy with. I went out and actually researched it because I cared about it. And so recommender systems are incredibly weird because you have to deal with that kind of difference between what is kind of serendipity of things I don't care about, and then what's serendipity of things I do care about. And that's a very, very hard thing to understand, I think. Sorry, that was very,
thank you.
There's a lot of digressions there. Yeah, other questions?
All right.
You first, yeah.
So you talked about, like, kind of obfuscating the actual like recommendation, like the percent chance of something occurring. And I've definitely dealt with that. Like, I've had someone call tell me, like, oh, but 60% is better than 30%. Why can't you tell me that? But how do you manage, like, I want them to have more trust or less trust in my recommendation based off of that. So how do you manage those, like, conflicting?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets down to how you're going to be wrong, right, as an algorithm, because those are the cases where it's most interesting, I think. So I don't know. That's why, like, judging whether, it's this idea of you don't know what that percentage confidence is that the person feels comfortable of doing something, right? You don't know what that percentage is, especially because the algorithm that the model that you're training in that case, right, is basing it off of the training data. And so you don't know how that maps to the real world necessarily without trying it out. And so I don't know, that's the part that I think is very interesting about, like, canonical stories within organizations. So if you ask someone the first day you start somewhere, so tell me, like, how does this place work, right? And they'll say, well, if you just do these two things, you'll be fine, but don't do this thing because that's really bad, right? That's basically prototypes and critiques of the data, essentially. And so, I don't know, it's about, I think that's why thinking about it from the standpoint of, we think about like explanations are more like stories to human beings, right? And so using stories is a very easy way for us to understand things, but interpretability ends up being over and over again how things work in that kind of summation of a model overall. And so I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but it's tough. You just have to test it out, right? Like in that case, the raw percentage was not helpful. But the idea of, we kind of ended up going with a little bit of a counterfactual type of thing. Like we would want you to do this because of these reasons, but then if it was like this, we would not want you to do that, right? Like that ended up being more understandable to people, but it's harder to build those types of things because there's other things you may need to take into account in that case, so, yeah, sorry. Yeah, sure.
In an earlier question, you alluded to time. You were talking about like legacy systems and sort of the notion that like all technology has its day and then it becomes old thing. In your practice, do you plan or have best practice or have think about the inevitability of obsolescence and mortality of technology?
I mean, I think the way we try to deal with that is by when we work with, I think in the consulting world, right, is that you can be very focused on just building out stuff and being like a dev shop. Once you start to get a bit above that, you start to do research and strategy where you're trying to understand kind of what is it that you need to do longer term. And then when you get up to the, I guess like the most meta consulting of all is like organizational consulting. But the truth is that all those problems are related. And so what I would say is the way we try to deal with that is by trying to basically implant the mentality of constant improvement with our customers. And so that's the only way that you can do that, is that when you do something with this system over here, that's gonna improve this, but now you're gonna discover the next problem. And so, I don't know, I think that's the biggest issue that we deal with, is it's usually the organizations themselves that can't get out of their own way of dealing with legacy stuff. And then one other thing I would just add about that is, my favorite law that I think I reference almost every talk I do, and I wouldn't say all conversations, but maybe 40% of conversations, is Gall's law, right? Which Gall's law says you cannot build a complex system. You have to create a simple system and then evolve it into a complex system. And I think that's true, and that's why things like replacing monolithic legacy systems never works out, right? Is because the fact that you're trying to, this thing that had been a lava flow over years and years and years to handle all these specialty use cases, the reason why you want to get rid of it is because a lot of the stuff that's been calcified there is no longer valid, right? But the reason why you can't get rid of it is because all this other stuff that is valid is kind of mixed in. And so I think the problem ends up becoming, like, we try to handle this in some of our, in our consultancy by trying to break off a small use case piece, maybe a job, job to be done is a way to think about this. Break that piece off and try to build the bare minimum of that and then iterate on top of it. And then break the next piece off. And so you're definitely in a more complex kind of network of things in that case, but it's more valuable, I think, for people to deal with it that way. So that's one. Yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you very much, everybody.